Hey everyone, before we get into the podcast itself, we have a few announcements that we'd like to make. The first of which is
I want to tell History's Most listeners about Fighting for Spain, the International Brigades in the Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Fighting for Spain is the new book from me, Alexander Clifford, and as you can tell from the title, it's focused on the International Brigades, that famous force of communist, socialist, left-wingers who came from around the world to fight in the Spanish Civil War. What I do in the book is focus on the military history of the International Brigades, which up to now, in the English language at least, really has been neglected. Fighting for Spain is a highly illustrated book with over 150 photographs, images, tables, charts, maps, and all sorts. So it's excellent for the military history enthusiasts to give them both a sense of the combat that international brigaders went through, the enemies they faced, the kind of disasters and calamities, as well as the successes on the battlefield. So, Fighting for Spain, published by Pen and Sword Books, is out in August.
And in addition to that, just to let you know, History's Most is now on Patreon.
Yes, it may seem like everyone on the planet has a Patreon now, and we do too, but why? As we said in our very first episode, History's Most is a passion project, but it comes with costs. It does cost us to host the podcast online and get it to your podcast platforms, and also we research, we buy books, that sort of thing. So if you want to support our unique brand of long-form, in-depth, conversational, accessible history podcasting, your support would be used to keep us going, to cover those costs going forwards.
And you can support us on Patreon with either a donation of $1 a month, or if you want to have your name shouted out at the end of an episode and listed as an executive producer on the show, you can donate $5 a month as well.
We would be eternally grateful for any and all support that you could give us for our content. We're asking primarily for $1 a month, which is 50 cents a show, which we think represents good value. If you do too, the link to our Patreon is in the description. And if you sign up for our Patreon this month, your name will be entered into a prize draw. What's the prize, I hear you asking? Well, it is a copy of the Penguin Monarchs series biography of Oliver Cromwell, someone we've obviously discussed a lot. So, for a chance to win David Horspool's biography of Oliver Cromwell, sign up to our Patreon by the end of the month. If you join our higher tier, your name will be entered into the prize draw twice.
And one more exciting announcement is
we'd like to announce the creation of the History's Most Facebook group. This is going to be a place where you can obviously find out about the release of future episodes, but more importantly, it'll be a forum for discussion, debate, things like polls, maybe even memes relating to our episodes and the questions we pose. What was history's most unlikely victory? Vote now. Who is history's most guilty man? Again, have your say. This is a chance for you to share your historical wisdom with like-minded history fans.
Yeah, we often say in our episodes that we want to hear ideas for future episodes and feedback and discussion about the topics that we're talking about, but we realized that we didn't actually have any real place to do that. So that is one of the reasons why we are creating a Facebook group.
Yeah, a small oversight from us. Many of you have got in touch, tweeting in replies to our episodes or emailing our History's Most Gmail account, but that isn't really a discussion. And the whole point of our episode titles is to try and provoke discussion, debate, and this is going to be the place where you can do that. The link to the new History's Most Facebook group is in the description.
And with all that being said, it is time for the episode. We hope you enjoy. War is always horrific and brutal. But I want you to imagine a war where that brutality is not only amplified by the conditions that it's being fought under, but reveled in by the people fighting it. A war in which killing was viewed as a way of life by some. A war where the battle cry, Viva la muerte, long live death, was common. And a war that was mired in such controversy that it divided not only people on the home front, but the army itself, about whether or not it was even worth fighting anymore. Those lines of division will have severe consequences for the future of Spain. But they were drawn here, in the Moroccan Rif, host to history's worst colonial war. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another very, very special episode of history's worst colonial war. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and we are joined today by Mark from the Record of Arms podcast. And the reason that Mark's joining us is he is going to talk to us about a topic that we have skirted around the edges of in previous History's Most episodes. We're going to be looking at the war in Spanish Morocco in the 1920s, which played a kind of background role in our 20th Century Spain series. It helped explain some of the developments we talked about in terms of domestic Spanish politics. But in of itself, it is a fascinating, bloody and terrible conflict. And that's why Mark's on the show. So thanks very much for joining us, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Let's get straight into it then. Why was Spain in Morocco in the first place? What was the history of their involvement?
Well, Spain had been in Morocco basically since the days of Columbus. They had a number of little enclaves on the North African coast opposite the Straits of Gibraltar that had been taken in the wars dating from like the reconquest of the peninsula from the Moors. So they had one place called Ceuta, which was dated from, I think, 1587, and then another town on another Cape Tres Forcas, called Melilla, which I believe dated to 1497. So really, since the days of Columbus, they'd been there, but they really hadn't done much with the territory except to hold those two towns. They didn't really start to expand into the land around that until much later, until like the latter half of the 19th century. And this was largely due to the fact that they lost most of their colonial empire overseas in the latter half of the 19th century, which had a number of effects on their army, one of which was, of course, there was a sense of national humiliation where they wanted to regain the military glory that the Spanish had had back in like the 16th century. And second, just in a practical sense, it was the only place where a Spanish officer could go and serve and expect to see battlefield service wherein he could earn a rapid promotion. So without a place for them to actually undertake active operations, a Spanish officer was doomed to a long career of very slow promotion, very slow given the fact that the Spanish Army's officer corps was very bloated and large. So most of what happened in Spanish Morocco until about the 1890s was, skirmishes with the local tribesmen that lived there. It was a very violent society in which they lived, where there was no real strong central authority to keep the very independent highland tribes in line. So basically Spain would be involved in like a small scale uprising where there would be like a local warlord or a local leader of some kind who would undertake a number of raids and then would eventually be put down in the course of like a couple months or something. Nothing very serious. The largest trouble that they had there would have been in 1909. There was a pretender to the Moroccan throne known as El Rogui, or sometimes known as Bouhamara, made himself independent of the Moroccan Sultan in the eastern part of Morocco and in Algeria. This person ruled there at a time when the Rif Mountains, over which he had sovereignty, was discovered to have very valuable mineral deposits in it. And in order to make a fortune, he sold the rights of these lands to European mining interests. And this led to his downfall because the people whose lands he had disposed of rose up and defeated his forces in battle and sent him to the Moroccan Sultan in chains. This then led to the Rifians, who had been aroused by this and who were victorious, to then turn on the Spanish who were there. This led them to ambush a group of Spaniards who were working on a railroad line that was going into one of the mining areas, killing some of the workers and some of the soldiers there, and driving the Spanish back to the outskirts of Melilla, which was the major town in that area. This led to a response from the Spaniards where they sent several thousand people to Melilla to fight this off, and ended up like putting the revolt down in maybe like a couple months or so. But this was really the only major problem they had in that area up until the time that I am basically covering in my podcast, which would be more towards like 1920.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a colonial outpost that had not been, like you say, until the discovery of these mines, had not been really exploited by the Spanish. But then it gains some monetary value, but also, like you say, the martial value of this is the only place where the Spanish army can kind of go and win some glory after the defeat, the disaster in 1898 in the Spanish-American War and such events. But as we covered when we talked about history's worst democracy in the Restoration era Spain, when full-scale war, if you like, begins in Morocco, it doesn't go terribly well for the Spanish. So what changes in the early 1920s from this being quite small scale to being quite a serious colonial conflict?
Well, two things really happen. Basically, Spain ended up facing two major threats in this area. In the western part of their territory, which was a very small territory, like it was about the size of one of the New England states of America, so it's like not a very large territory. But in the western half of it, there was a warlord by the name of Moulay al-Razuli, who was a type of traditional Moroccan warlord that you would generally find, who had a religious background. He had an element of Islamic mysticism as part of his authority. But he was mainly kind of a bandit chieftain and also sort of a Robin Hood figure where he would take money from the rich and give it to the poor, etc. He ended up being very successful at this and consolidating his power in the western half of the country. This was who Spain was operating against most in 1920. The Spanish army in the west was trying to close in on this person who had his headquarters at a town called Tazarut in the middle of the mountains of a region of Spanish Morocco called the Jabala. They were closing in on him with this campaign. They brought like most of their army was operating there, kind of slowly moving in on him. In the east, they were fighting against these same Rifian tribes that I talked about in the 1909 actions. And these were less of a concrete threat at that time because they were not united under any major ruler. So all the actions that they would have fought against them were like disorganized local revolts. However, a leader was arising amongst these tribes who would become like the biggest threat that Spain had there. He would unite all of these warlike tribes under his own leadership. But this hadn't actually happened in 1920. This wouldn't happen until the next year. And that would be the large escalation of the wars once the central Rifian tribes became united and struck against the Spanish.
Let's then paint a picture. If we've got this at the dawn of the 1920s, this growing trouble and violence in Morocco, can you paint a picture for us, Mark, of the two warring sides in this conflict? What was the state of the Spanish army militarily, and in terms of the Rifian rebel tribes, what military hardware did they have access to?
Okay, well, I'll start with the Rifians. In terms of military hardware that they had, most of what they had was stuff that they captured from Spain. So they would be armed almost entirely with exactly the same weapons as the Spanish throughout this entire war. And that includes like a a large complement of artillery, machine guns, mortars, hand grenades, all types of like modern small arms. Uh, these were men who lived in a society that was very violent and lawless, where justice was exercised by retribution by like the family or the victims of the crime itself. So your average Rifian man, and this would also be for like non-Rifians who were also in this area, would have been used to fighting. They would have had training with arms ever since their childhood. They would have been bred to like endurance, used to working together in small bands of like, foot soldiers, basically, because horses were very rare in this area. Basically, they were like every military age man was a fighter in these places, and they, like violence was something that happened very, very commonly in their lives. So these were very tough fighters. They natural guerrilla fighters that knew the land very well, knew how to take advantage of it. All in all, they were about the toughest indigenous resistance movement that like you really see in this time, and especially being as they were armed with almost exactly the same weapons and in almost exactly the same quantity. They're very formidable to the Spanish and then later also the French. And the Spanish army was a little bit more complicated of a picture. The great mass of the Spanish army consisted of conscripted infantrymen who were, they were serving their 1 year of national service. They were very motivated, usually were illiterate and unskilled. They were very badly treated by their officers. The officer corps as a whole was very corrupt, and like practices such as the stealing of the supplies and money that were meant for the troops were very common. The military skill of the Spanish officers was at a very low level most of the time. Even the ones who were more motivated generally had tactical ideas that would have been more appropriate to the 1870s, 1880s era. And most of them were just simply incompetent altogether. There were two special corps of the Spanish army that were kind of coming into being at this time that were specific to the colonial army. And they were a response to the fact that these conscript soldiers led by these basically incompetent officers performed very, very poorly against like the Rifian rebels, who could basically make mincemeat of them. So the first response that the Spanish made to this was to simply raise a corps of Moroccan soldiers of their own. These were called the Fuerzas Regulares Indigenas, usually just called the Regulares. These were organized into units that were almost entirely identical to the units that the Rifians themselves would have just traditionally raised, called Harcas. These were instead called tabors under Spanish authority. They would have been led by Spanish officers, and they would have been in the forefront of the fighting from like 1911 on. These would have been the men that they would have sent out to fight any offensive action, whereas they would have tried to keep the conscripts in garrisons and in fortresses where they would be at less risk. Later on, they would form a special corps, which would go on to be very important to like the later development of the Spanish army and then the Spanish state, because sort of Franco's dictatorship grows out of this corps, which was the Tercio de Extranjeros, a Spanish Foreign Legion. And these were men who were raised as a dedicated corps of hardcore professional colonial soldiers, long service professional soldiers, to serve exclusively in the colonies. And they had a very tough ethos that kind of had a element of religious redemptionism in it and Catholic theology, where they were looking for, they made an appeal to men who felt that they had no place in the regular world, or who had a past that they were trying to leave behind. And they offered to these men a chance of redemption by like serving the cause of Spain. I don't know if I explained that very well.
It sounds a little bit like the Carlists in the way that they're ferociously religiously motivated.
Yes, it is. It does have like an element of Carlism in it, like sort of like a throwback to like maybe the old crusading ideas of Catholicism that grew out of the Reconquista. Like the idea that you could sacrifice, you could redeem your your past mistakes through blood sacrifice in the cause of Spain, which was also the cause of religion. You know, this group was made up by like a guy by the name of Jose Milan Estrella, who was a very important officer in this time. He was kind of the soul of Spanish militarism at this time.
Mm-hmm.
When you see him in the Spanish Civil War, he is mutilated from this war that he led a lot of the main battles in. He lost an eye and an arm and a leg, and he looks basically like a caricature of the idea of militarism. Just this battered man who came up with this very fierce ideology. The unit that he created would be by far the most important that the Spanish used in this war. It would fight almost all of the major actions and would be in the forefront of all the major campaigns. And it was really this unit that gave so much of the brutal character of this war. They had a reputation for just indiscriminate berserker-like aggression, which was consciously cultivated as an element of terror to, add that to their weaponry, is that they would be terrified of the Legion.
Mm.
I've seen it described, the Foreign Legion, as almost having a kind of proto-fascist ideology at the root of it. I mean, the Regulares, as effective and as terrifying as they were, raising of native troops was pretty standard colonial practice that a lot of powers did. And although the Spanish Foreign Legion was supposed to be modeled on the French Foreign Legion, in reality, the similarities are kind of fairly few, because the Spanish Foreign Legion, as you say, came to be such an embodiment of Spanish imperialism and militarism and well, even nationalism, I would say, to the point where it produces not just Francisco Franco, but a lot of his colleagues that are going to go on to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Do you think that the Foreign Legion had a kind of decisive impact, not just on this colonial war, but a kind of on Spanish history in the 20th century?
Oh, yes, no doubt. Like, I believe that without the embodiment and the vehicle that it provided for the ambitions of all these men who would serve in it and then go on to lead basically both sides of the Civil War later, there really wouldn't have been any way for these men to have risen to positions of power. And then secondarily, for their particular ideology, which was, again, based on like blind obedience, blind aggression, and the redemptive power of violence, which are all pretty standard fascist themes, to take root anywhere in like Spanish political life, because these ideas really aren't found very much anywhere in any other aspect of Spanish life. Like it's as though there's just this one that every man in Spain who was motivated in this way would have like wanted to have his career in this unit, and they would have all gone there, and they would have all simply been concentrated in there. So I believe it kind of gave an embodiment to this type of power in Spanish life that wouldn't have been there before. Yeah,
I think that to paint a picture for the listeners as well of the kind of thing that the Foreign Legion, were famous for the atrocities they committed, but also the fact that they openly celebrated those atrocities. They posed for pictures with, severed heads. Mm-hmm. They wore ears of Moroccans that they killed on their uniforms. They, to me, they are like the embodiment of Mussolini once said, "A minute on the battlefield is better than a lifetime of peace," which is a kind of fascist idea of perpetual conflict as being the ultimate human state to be in. Somehow that war is the zenith of humanity. And I think that the Foreign Legion are one of the stark examples of that put into practice. Violence and war being celebrated as not just, a necessary thing we need to do to achieve our nation's aims or to defend our country, but almost as a kind of perfect state of being. We are the cream of Spain. We are the best that our country has to offer, and we're going to prove it by being as brutal as possible.
Am I wrong in thinking that the unit's motto. Was that "Long live death"?
Yes, yes, it was "Viva la Muerte," long live death. And when they would call themselves to battle, their battle cry would be like the Legion, please come to die. You know, like they made a great deal out of it, as almost as if it was a cult of death. You know, like as though the willingness to die was the point of life. You know, like that was the fullness of life. Like you said, like 1 hour on the battlefield. You know, like it really was that type of thing. That the other type of life was pale and boring and useless, basically. And this was the dark side of that type of ideology. Is like, while it glorified martial valor and all of the martial values, it treated with total contempt the people who did not have this, or people who were helpless. You know, so this leads directly into the atrocities that you see here, which were almost always against helpless people. They were always against captured POWs or just innocent civilians. This wasn't like a regrettable necessity for the legionaries. This was something that they thought was great. You know, they thought that this was one of the points of doing this. You know, not in a practical way, but sort of as a way of building character, I guess you might say.
Commit atrocities to make yourself, I don't know, just
like you become pure through it.
Yeah, prevent yourself from being demoralized as well, I guess.
Exactly, and that's just very similar to the fascist ideology, which would look at like what they might call like a bourgeois liberal state as being decadent and weak and useless.
Yeah, and they kind of othered the civilian and the kind of democratic world, didn't they? In the same way that they othered the Moroccan natives. Like we said, they kind of viewed themselves as a class apart and somehow superior to that.
Yes, very much so. And like you can see this later in the Civil War when these people are turned against the Spanish civil population. In particular, you can see because in the Spanish Civil War, they're fighting side by side with the people who would have been the enemies in this war. Most of the Spanish army, well, at least the part of the Spanish army that was actually raised among Spanish subjects, was raised among the Moroccan tribesmen who would then go to Spain to fight. So the core of Franco's army was an alliance of the two enemies in this war, who shared a lot of these values. Like the Moroccan warrior ethos was very similar to this. Like they also tortured their captives. They also committed atrocities of helpless people, and they had very similar ideas about it, that this was how you proved yourself to be a man. Like in a lot of places, it was considered to be inappropriate for a young man to marry unless he had killed an enemy in one of these vendettas and feuds that went on all the time.
Wow.
So like you could see that like these two groups of people had a lot more in common with each other than they would have had with a citizen of Madrid or Valencia, who they would have seen as simply soft cattle, basically. People who had not earned the right to exist.
I remember that during the troubles leading up to the Spanish Civil War and the kind of political violence, there was a African Easter officer, as in a Spanish officer who'd served in Morocco, for the listeners there, who said that there had been a minor rebellion in Badajoz province, and he said that in a corner of Badajoz, Moroccan tribesmen have a base. So basically applying the lessons of the colonial war to just their own people, and that would have devastating consequences in the civil war to come. And also I particularly interesting your point about how you mentioned how on both sides, and I've kind of emphasized in my own writings that probably in my opinion, one of the best Republican commanders was Juan Modesto, who, although he was a communist, had served in the Spanish Foreign Legion. So I think he's this is a bit of a tangent, but I think his kind of caustic style as a commander was a large part because of the culture of the Army of Africa. But to return to the Moroccan War, because we've kind of gone on a little rabbit hole there into the culture of the Army of Africa and the Foreign Legion. Um, let's return to the Moroccan War, and things go badly for the Spanish in 1921. What changes in 1921?
Well, what really changed in 1921 was the emergence of the Abdelkrim brothers as leaders of the central Rifian tribes. Kind of behind the scenes for the past couple years, they had been up in the mountains of the central Rif, trying to get these tribes together to fight in a common cause. And these were a different type of leader than had normally arisen in Spanish Morocco, where normally you would have basically a warlord type person who had a group of henchmen and a small area that he dominated, basically a minor power. These were something different. These were Europeanized, educated, very cultured people who were seeking not to simply rebel against Spain, but to set up an independent state with a prime minister and foreign ministries that would be like an equal in the European family of nations. So this was a genuine nationalist independence movement, and it was something that hadn't really been seen before. This was nurtured by a pair of brothers, both of them. They have very similar names. There's Muhammad al-Dilkram, and then there's Mahmed al-Dilkram. The major older brother is the figurehead of this rebellion and the main leader. He became kind of a symbol of nationalist rebellion throughout the entire Arab world at this time, because his was the first rebellion that really had a chance of succeeding. He was an educated man. He had been a journalist in Melilla in his early career and worked in the colonial administration as sort of an intermediary between the normal tribal power structures and the Spanish administration. While he was doing this, he became disillusioned with Spanish rule through contact with Spanish officials, where he realized that they were never going to really take the interests of the colonial people seriously, that they were simply going to exploit their land and take what they could get from them. And as a result, he stopped trying to work within the system, I guess you could say. His brother was a brilliant scholar and was at the time that the rebellion began to be plotted, was studying engineering in Madrid and was mixing with the high society of Madrid. He was called back to the Rif, basically because their brother's father, who had some dealings with a German mining company. The Spanish suspected the Germans of smuggling arms into the Rif during the First World War, which is something that they were doing in order to try and cause trouble for the French down there during the war. So they retaliated against all of the natives who had dealings with these German companies. And as a result of this, they burned down the Abdelkrim brothers' father's house. And they fled into the mountains to basically plot their revenge.
So the Al-Krim brothers decide to raise a revolt in the Rif, and they end up inflicting a disastrous defeat upon the Spanish at the Battle of Anual in 1921. How does that come about?
Well, throughout 1920 and the first part of 1921, the Spanish had been pushing into the Rif from Melilla, which means basically they were moving south and then west. And as they moved west, they started to come closer to the center of the Rif. And this is where the real concentration of strength of the Abdelkrim brothers' alliance was. They're like their own particular tribe, the Beni Reguel, was in the middle of the Rif. It was the most densely populated part and was considered to be the most formidable of the tribes in the Rif. As the troops under General Silvestre were coming west from the east, they ran into very light opposition and managed to make a lot of progress up towards a place called the Omicron River. They had a deceptively easy time of doing this because while they were pushing through here during that campaigning season, most of the Rifian men were away in Algeria working on French farms and towns due to the poverty of the region and very poor harvests in the time. So they basically set up systems of fortification and transport through these places that they thought were submitted but weren't really. As they got towards the center of the Rif, basically the Rifians drew a line and said, if they go past the Amarcran River, that's where we're going to really fight. They reached, as they got towards the Amarcran River, they set up a base at a place called Anwal. This was a larger base than they normally did. Most of the Spanish defensive network was made up of little tiny blockhouses that would be held by like 12 or 20 men. They were just kind of scattered along the countryside in not necessarily very well sited positions. What I'm trying to get across here is that the Spanish defensive network was very weak. When they got to Anwal, they continued to push in. The Rifians, some of the Rifians who had been collaborating with the Spanish, warned General Silvestre, who is the leader of this, he's a very brash and swaggering figure, not to go past this river. Nonetheless, he crossed the river and set up a outpost at a place called Monte Albaran. This was the trigger for the revolt. Not long after the establishment of this base at Monte Albaran, the Rifians attacked in much larger strength than they had up until this point. And they were aided by a defection of some of the Spanish regulares that were holding the base. This ended up in a rout of the Spanish where they fled back across the river towards their base at Anwal. Next to Anwal was another base that they had set up on high ground overlooking the base. This is called Iguaraben. Iguaraben was put under siege, and like most of the Spanish bases, it didn't have very much storage capacity for supplies and was dependent on constant resupply. So a siege was an urgent problem for any of the Spanish garrisons. The rest of the Spanish at Anwal tried to break through to the Iguaraben base, but this was only approachable through like a narrow ravine, which is very easily blocked. This was not able to be relieved. And this base eventually fell with a great slaughter of the people who were holding it. Once they had this base, they were overlooking the main Spanish base at Anwal and were able to fire like directly into it. Once the news of this reverse came to General Silvestre, who was in Melilla at the time, he rushed there with the troops that he had on hand, but most of his troops were scattered in little penny packets all throughout the country. And he had maybe about 4,000 people at Anwal. And again, these were mainly conscript infantry who were not really very well-trained soldiers and not really very well-disciplined. They were suddenly surrounded by thousands and thousands of very victorious, very formidable tribesmen who were firing artillery and machine guns directly into their ranks. They held out there for about 18 hours or so, and then a council of war was decided among the senior Spanish officers there as to what to do, and they decided to withdraw back to Melilla, even though this would mean basically abandoning the entire Spanish position in the east. As they started off on this retreat, they were subject to sniping, subject to ambushes out of the numerous ravines and hilltops that like they were having to pass through. And under this pressure, and also under the very visible fear that their officers were displaying, the discipline of the Spanish army simply broke, and the regiments melted away into like a horde of fleeing individuals who were cut up into small groups and hunted down like rabbits, is what all the sources say. Nobody really knows how many of them were killed in this. The estimates range between something like 3,000 people and as many as 25,000. It was the biggest disaster that has happened to a European colonial army in the 20th century. Once this main battle was over, the entire Spanish defensive network fell apart in the Eastern Rif, and soon the Rifians were right at the outskirts of Melilla, and the entire Spanish position in Morocco was threatening to be snuffed out.
It seems to me that this massive disaster, it had both kind of tactical and strategic flaws behind it as to why it went so badly wrong for the Spanish. I mean, in terms of the strategic setup, I believe each of their kind of little blockhouses or bunkers they had, like you say, which had like 10, 12 men garrisoning them dotted around the countryside, then just became easy pickings for the rebels to just eliminate one by one. And on a tactical level, Silvestre's kind of idea first of marching out there quite rashly, I think, with his army into what was essentially a hopeless position at Anual, and then once they were there, trying to march back in hostile country. I mean, you might say it was the least bad option, but it seems like just a series of errors on all kind of levels that have led to this utter catastrophe.
Oh yes, it's definitely was a very disastrous series of errors. The Spanish officer, especially Silvestre, kind of illustrates like an idea of like what a lot of the Spanish officer corps thought like here, which they depended on guts, they depended on cojones and just aggression to achieve their purpose. And when it came to a position like this, they really just didn't have very much idea what to do. And like, yeah, the leadership was not enough to hold the army together. And like you said, they were scattered throughout all these vulnerable blockhouses, and those were reliant on constant supply convoys. And it was very obvious to the people manning these that very soon no more supplies were going to be coming. So a lot of the blockhouses weren't even defended. The garrison was compelled to retreat, and they were simply killed on the way back to Melilla, fleeing without any real plan. It was just a total collapse. Like there's not really any other way to. It's like just within the course of like a couple hours, like the entire army fell apart in the eastern part of their protectorate.
So what's the impact then of this disaster on Spain and the army and the war as a whole?
Well, while this was going on in the east, there was a campaign going on at the same time in the west against the bandit El Razuli, who I mentioned before. And as a matter of fact, the final assault against his fortress was just about to go on. It was supposed to go on the same day that Anual happened. This was under the command of the High Commissioner of Spanish Morocco, Damaso Berenguer, who was a very different man than Silvestre. He believed in a very gradual incorporation of Spain, of the territory under Spanish rule. And because of that, he had kind of cautioned Silvestre, try not to take too much, Well, what this obviously meant that this campaign had to come to an end. So this was like sort of a reprieve for Razuli, who was about to be defeated. Much of Berenguer's army had to be sent back to Ceuta and then take ship to go to Melilla in order to save the city from falling. And this included the newly formed Legion, which was fighting in its first campaign here, as well as like a large number of the Regulares. After they got there, just thousands and thousands of troops from the Spanish Peninsula began to pour in. And these were all conscripts, which were, like, conscription was a great irritant in Spanish politics. It was extremely unpopular. Mm. Most of the colonial effort was unpopular in Spain, and they certainly didn't want to send their sons to die there. And this led to a destabilization of the government, which is, I think, as you said, you covered the worst democracy, so the Canovite system wasn't really very popular with most of the Spanish people. And this was one of the main factors that led to its destabilization and the rise of Primo de Rivera later.
Yeah, so it did. It was almost like a second humiliation after 1898 and the disaster at the hands of the Americans. This was, again, something that really shook the political system. And it forced, as you say, the Spanish to withdraw from their gains in Morocco. What came next? Did they, you said reinforcements were flooding into their protectorate. Were they able to kind of turn the tables on the El Crims, or, was it more of were they on the back foot for a while?
Well, they were able to make a comeback, but it was very hard comeback to make. Like, as the troops came into Melilla, the city within a few weeks was no longer actually in any danger anymore. And the Legion in particular had set up a defensive perimeter around the city. And by September, they were ready to start moving back into the Rif. However, at this time, the situation had changed in regard to like how they had advanced against it the previous year. For one, because all the fighting men had come back from Algeria. So now there were many, many more armed men in this territory that they had already overrun. And second, the prestige of the successful rebellion at Anwal had like rallied all of the divided tribes of the Rif into a common cause, and had raised basically an army that was much, much larger than the Spanish had been used to dealing with. However, this was a guerrilla army and didn't really want to fight like pitched battles against the Spanish. So they retreated in front of the Spanish for the most part throughout 1920, through the remainder of 1921 and into 1922. So very slowly, the Spanish sort of fought their way back through the area that Silvestre had taken in 1920 and 1921. And by early 1923, they were basically back at the same line they were at Anwal. They had fought really hard to get here, but really the Rifians hadn't really engaged them yet. They had just sort of fought delaying actions and had kind of had the same resolve that they had before, which was they would fight on the eastern side of the Amarcran River in their real homeland. So the situation simply reproduced itself again a couple of years later. As the Spanish pushed forward, they set up an almost identical defensive system. And then they set up another line that was almost entirely on the same line that they had held at Anwal. Here, a stalemate developed because the Rifians couldn't really push the Spanish out of their forts, although they kept trying to. Their main object of their strategy was to trigger another Anwal, which they hoped would not really defeat the Spanish, because they didn't really think they could militarily defeat the Spanish, but they wanted to break the Spanish will to fight and create another disaster that would cause the Spanish government to withdraw. They did the same thing in the west against Raizuli, where like right after they had to withdraw from the campaign where they were encroaching on Raizuli, they had to kind of come back on that too, because he obviously went back into that power vacuum as soon as he had the opportunity to. So really the Anwal disaster, it took 2 full years for them to recover back to the same position that they had been at before. So that's pretty much the story of the war from like June 1921 until like maybe November 1923.
And all that time, it seems to me that the conflict, as well as, taking several years to retake what had been lost so rapidly, it has a even more brutal character, the campaign, after Anwal, in terms of the way that both sides treated the prisoners, the way the occupying Spanish kind of treated the native population, and the use of not just atrocities, mutilations, and that sort of thing, but also, I believe, chemical weapons as well.
Yeah, there is some evidence that the Spanish used. Well, in my sources, it says the Franco-Spanish troops used chemical weapons. So I'm not really sure exactly to what degree the Spanish used poison gas, but they definitely did. There's definitely mention of it in the later campaigns, like the campaigns of 1925 or so, is where I normally find it mentioned. But the regular fighting was brutal enough. Like most of just the straight combat that happened would have been small groups of lightly armed riflemen with bayonets and grenades as the main weapons that would be used. Usually quick, sharp ambushes, all the fighting at point blank range. Just very, very vicious and bloody fighting. Like about the most brutal modern combat that you can think of. Like kind of think of like World War I trench warfare, except just in the desert, like without thousands of guys and without much artillery, just bayonets and hand grenades.
It's almost sounds even worse in some ways.
Yeah, but this was all being done by these two groups of men who had this as their idea of how men act.
Yeah.
that they would seek these type of things rather than like maybe another type of army would not want to get into close combat like that and would set up, more of an area control system where you like just tried to hold bases and roads and stuff like that and didn't really do all these small unit actions. But the Spanish never really adapted their system to this until much later in the war, until like after the Primo de Rivera regime came into account. So really the history of this part of the conflict is just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little small actions of a few dozen men, maybe a couple hundred men, who are going to escort a convoy to a post that needs to be supplied, or a post that's surrounded by Rifians or Jabali rebels. And they can't really bring the enemy to combat to the point where they can actually force them to submit. So you see over and over again that like the same post will have to have an operation mounted to break a siege or to resupply it maybe 4 or 5 times in a week. And each one of these battles would just be unbelievably bloody on the scale that we're talking about. Like I know in one action that's kind of illustrative of this, after Anwal, there was a raid by certain Rifian Harkas under Mahmed, far into the much further east than much further west rather than they would normally fight in the region of the Gamara, which Legion had a base at a coastal place called Wood Lao on the Mediterranean coast, the River Lao. Mahmed's Harkas struck this place, which was held by a newly raised bandera, or a battalion-sized unit of the Spanish Foreign Legion. These two actions were the first 2 actions of this newly raised Spanish unit, which would perhaps been about 400, 500 men. They lost half of their strength and killed and grievously wounded in just these 2 actions. Like, and this was very typical. Like the casualty rates would be enormously high. Like you were virtually certain to get like a very serious wound if you were in any of these fights for very long.
Reminds me to some extent of the Spanish Civil War, where the best units on either side tend to be more. They were ideologically committed rather than they had any particular tactical or military skill. The Foreign Legion in the Spanish Civil War suffers incredibly high casualties, despite it being like the military elite. So when you kind of put that ideology that we talked about in some depth into actual military practice, you get soldiers who are fanatical, who will fight really hard, but also who will die in very large numbers because of the way modern warfare is, that if you just want to be blood and guts and charge at the enemy and win a medal, you might not last very long.
No, you're right. That's exactly right. Like there is not very much tactical finesse in any of these battles, except on the Rifian side, especially the Mahmed, the younger Abdelkrim brother, who was the commander in chief of their army. In the operations that he's involved in, he proved himself to be a very skilled guerrilla leader. But like, yes, in terms of like, Spanish tactics, later they improved quite a bit, but like during this time, it's just run and yell and stab. And this is also very similar to like what you see in the first part of the Spanish Civil War, where it's like very ideologically committed people, as you say. It's like anarchist militias and communist militias, and then the Spanish Foreign Legion. I mean, in the case of the anarchist militias and communist militias, they would make a point of the fact that they didn't know how to they didn't know tactics. They would count on their cojones, and this seems to be a phenomenon not just of Spanish militarism, but just of like sort of a Spanish idea of manhood, that it's cowardly to dig trenches, it's weak to like not to like lay on the ground and shoot. You want to run at the man, like, yeah, it leads to almost all those people being killed to the point where you kind of get the feeling that they're seeking death rather than trying to gain victory.
So you mentioned that there's a sort of change as time goes on, and a big part of that, I believe, is once General Primo de Rivera becomes the leader of Spain. There's a military coup in September 1923. We covered that in, we called him history's most benevolent dictator. But he also changes policy in Morocco. So in the kind of 1923, 1924, I believe they take on a more defensive stance.
That's true, yes. Like really they take a much more realistic approach to the war in Spain at that time, and that really is the work of Primo de Rivera. And like I don't really like to praise a military dictator ever, but like how you say, he was a pretty benevolent dictator. Like you get the sense that he was committed to the good of Spain by his lights, and actually in his view, he kind of viewed the Spanish protectorate itself as more trouble than it was worth, and thought that like it might be good just to abandon the thing altogether. However, the Africanista element of the army would not have this, obviously. Yeah. And even though there wasn't very much support for the colonial effort amongst the Spanish population, it was basically impossible, even as a military dictator, to go against the Spanish officer corps that was committed to this. However, he did end up implementing a much more effective strategy, even though it was still not extremely effective. Instead of trying to go out and chase these rebels and hold all of these indefensible positions, they pulled back to a much more defensible line, where they tried to hold just the area in the immediate area of Tetuan and Ceuta in the west. They set up a fortified line between there and the international city of Tangier, where a lot of the Rifian arms came through overland smuggling. Like they would buy their arms in Tangier and then smuggle them across the land to like the Rif, which the Spanish were basically powerless to stop. Primo de Rivera set a fortified line across that and stopped a lot of it. But one of the main reasons that this had effect was they weren't fighting all of these costly battles anymore, in which most of the weapons that the Rifians used were captured. So this cut off the main source of supply for the Rifian armies, who didn't have any way to make guns and bullets. They just had to capture them or buy them abroad. So this significantly restricted that. This led to like the Abdelkrims and Raizuli having like less victories, therefore having less prestige and having less of an ability to hold their alliances of basically centrifugal tendency tribes together. It also forced them to look for a way to break the stalemate, because they couldn't break through the Spanish lines on the west or the east. And this led them to move south towards the French. And this was what really ended the war for the Abdelkrims. Was they could fight the Spanish and maybe hope to exhaust them to have a settlement, but they couldn't fight a Spanish-French alliance.
Yeah, so in 1925, I believe, the Alcrims managed to annoy the French, who control the other part of Morocco, and France signs an alliance with Primo de Rivera and joins the war. So what's the impact? And do the French have, are they kind of noticeably better at fighting the Rifian rebels, or are there problems?
Well, not really. When the Rifians first turn on the French, they have a rapid series of victories, just like they had against the Spanish, and they take a lot of the immediate like territory on the Spanish-French zonal border around the River Vuelga. However, the advantage that the French had, aside from simply being a much more powerful country with like lots more resources to call on, was that they had administered their colony in Morocco a considerable amount better than the Spanish had. It was under the leadership of Marshal Hubert Lyautey, who I have no idea if I'm saying his name right, who was a very gifted colonial administrator who had actually made a very good reputation for France in Morocco. So whereas most of the Rifian tribesmen who were in the Spanish part of the Moroccan protectorate rallied to Abdelkrim's standard very easily, not very many did in the French sector. So it was mainly just Rifians right on the border or who were coming from Spain who attacked France. This led to the French starting to advance northwards into the Rif after a while, which led to a third front in this war. And this was especially disastrous for the Rifians because most of their most of the food that they grew came from valleys around the Huerga River, which was then they were then cut off from because the French were occupying it.
So, what happens to Raizuli?
Well, Raizuli, that as when Anwal happened, he was just on the verge of defeat. Because Raizuli's power wasn't really very strong. Like, he was more of a cunning leader who played the Spanish off of the French and off of the Sultan. But when it came to a military confrontation, he would usually lose if the Spanish made a serious effort. By 1923, they were again on the verge of defeating him. There was another slow campaign in the west where they gradually closed in on his fortress at Tazarut. They besieged the mountain and were ready to once again press in for the final assault. And this is right when the Spanish government fell into a crisis, and the High Commissioner, who was Damaso Berenguer still, and the most of the senior leadership of the Spanish was kicked out of power at that time, and another government installed who wanted to solve the Moroccan crisis without any more bloodshed. They wanted to basically buy off Razuli. So, like, right at the point where he was defeated, they suddenly entered into negotiations with him and like ended up giving him like a substantially good deal where they left no obstacles to the resumption of his power. They withdrew from his territory. They even went so far as to like have Spanish soldiers building him a new palace to replace the one that they destroyed. And this really was a huge mistake on the Spanish side, because they could have, with a very little bit more effort, they could have like eliminated one of their major rivals. But instead, they just set him back into power, and this greatly enhanced his reputation, which was greatly enhanced by his appearance of having dealt with the Europeans so many times on equal terms and kind of come out on top all the time. So after this, however, most of his troops were destroyed, and after the Spanish withdrew from his territory, Abdelkrim sent his people into the power vacuum and managed to secure the defection of one of Raizuli's principal lieutenants, a man named Ahmed Herrero, who turned against him. And later in the year it would actually be a Rifian force that would finally storm Raizuli's fortress at Tazarut and take him prisoner. He would end up dying in Rifian captivity, I believe, towards the end of 1925. So after this point, Abdelkrim and his forces controlled the entirety of Spanish Morocco, aside from the Spanish coastal enclaves and their particular bases and fortresses that they have garrisoned at the time. So this was a tremendous victory for him. And it was right after he had secured this that the French began their advance into the central Rif.
So it almost for a second there looked like, Spain may have made a little bit of a breakthrough, a little bit of a move to do something, but comes tumbling down.
That's right, and it was right after this that Primo de Rivera rose to power. It was basically just kind of in the aftermath of this I don't know what you would call it, and it was a major mistake.
So we're at a situation in 1925 where the Alcrims are the dominant force in Morocco, or northern Morocco at least. Then the French get involved and put them in a bit of a bind. And the Spanish too want to join the French in staging major military operations again after the defensive policy that Primo had adopted. They then go on to the offensive against Al-Krim. And they attempt, because, that's the obvious solution, isn't it? They attempt an amphibious landing.
That's right. Where Abdelkrim's center of power was at a place that's called in my sources, they describe it as a dispersed community called Ashtir, which I guess would be like a collection of small towns and villages all clustered around the same valley. And this was just barely off the Mediterranean coast in an indentation in the shoreline, basically right in the middle of Spanish Morocco's coastline, called Alhucemas Bay. And most of the territory of the Beni Iroquois tribe, which was really the core of this rebellion, was right there. So it was an obvious idea that had been kind of postulated for like the past 10 years or so, that the way to bring this to an end would be to land troops directly there and simply take his capital. But this is kind of more difficult than just to say. So this really hadn't happened up until this point. But now that the French were involved, and now that like they could kind of catch him between the two pincers of the Spanish army holding them from the east and west, and then bringing this new front coming down from the north from the coast, while the French came up from the south. They could finally trap him between like four walls of troops and cut off his escape and finally bring this to an end. So that was what they attempted to do. There was sort of a rehearsal of this earlier in 1925, after Primo de Rivera had set up the line between Tetuan and Tangier. The territory of the tribe that lay between them, the Anyera tribe, was in revolt behind this fortified wall, and they used a landing at a place called Alcazar Seguir, where they landed elements of the Foreign Legion and the Regulares to sort of come and catch the rebels from behind instead of having to go through the highlands. And this was kind of like a small-scale rehearsal of what they wanted to do at Alhucemas Bay. So later they did end up mounting a large-scale operation where they sent two columns of ships, mainly Spanish ships. These were like, I think it was like 65 or 70 merchant ships, escorted by like about 35 ships of the Spanish Army and Spanish Navy rather, and a few ships from the French Navy. One column coming from Ceuta and the other coming from Melilla, and they both converged into the middle of Alhucemas Bay, which was heavily fortified by the Rifians because they obviously saw this coming. Like, Spanish operational security was never very good, so they knew that this was going to be coming sooner or later. So they had fortified the whole coast of the interior of the bay. So the Spanish landed instead on the outside of the bay on the cape. I can't remember what the actual cape is called, but it was on the opposite side of the bay from Ashtier, and came overland the 7 miles from Sabadia Beach to Ashtier. To advance from that beach to Ashtier took them about like 3 weeks, and that was like an index of like how desperately the Rifians were trying to fight them off from there. But it was a very well conducted amphibious operation, and this was kind of something that like restored, I guess you could say, the Spanish army's confidence in itself. They're like, right when this happened, obviously, like as I said, the Rifians knew it was coming, so they tried to launch a diversionary attack at a place called Cudia Tahar, which was on the defensive network right outside of the Spanish capital of Tetuan. They sent like a large proportion of their forces under Ahmed Herrero, who still had his army in the west that he had been using to subdue Razuli's old domain, and attacked this Spanish outpost there. And this was held by just regular Spanish peninsular conscript infantry troops who had proven themselves to be like relatively unreliable previously in the war. And they withstood a very determined siege for like quite some time, and held on to it for long enough for like elements of the Spanish Foreign Legion to come and relieve them. And this really kind of marked that like the average Spanish soldier and the average Spanish officer had somehow been winnowed out in the course of this war, and were like considerably tougher than they had been before. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the Legion took the lead in the fighting so much that some of its ethos had rubbed off onto the rest of the army, you might say, And then after this, there was simply a campaign to press into the central Rif from that base on the seashore there. And from that point, it was really only a matter of time until they brought Abdelkrim and his brother to bay.
And that happens, I believe, in 1926.
That's right. Yeah, they get to a place called Targuist, and there there's like a few small battles still against like the hardcore of the Abdelkrims had also raised a small regular army on European lines, and that's who fought these last large actions against the Spanish. But they were eventually ground down because by this time the Spanish had close to 500,000 men in the Protectorate, and the French had another 200,000 coming up. So they were just caught between a hammer and an anvil, basically.
And so this war that dragged on for 6 years, the most intense phase of it that we've described, and seen incredible casualty figures from a Spanish perspective, was it was brought to an end surprisingly quickly and easily, really. And also I think it's striking that the last phase of the war actually sounds pretty conventional in terms of, as in it's fought in a more conventional manner rather than a more guerrilla style of the majority of the conflict.
Yeah, that's true. It is very different in character. And I think that this shows how the Spanish had sooner or later adapted to the type of guerrilla warfare that they were engaged in, and was no longer really engaging on the Rifians' terms. And because of this, they weren't really fighting sort of an endless war at a grave disadvantage all the time. They were using their advantage of manpower and high technology weapons and logistical superiority to strike directly at the center of enemy power. And like once this happened, they brought about a pretty quick collapse.
What sort of impact then did this war have on Spain? Because we've kind of hinted at parts of it, and I know that Francisco Franco made his name in this war. I think he was either in command or certainly in command of a large unit during the amphibious landing that we discussed. And he then gets appointed to, a couple of years later, to head the Spanish military academy. So it's very much the ideas and the culture of the Moroccan War and of the Legion that gets imbued into the next generation of the Spanish army. What do you think the impact of this conflict is?
Well, I think a lot of it is what you just said right there, is that it formed the vehicle to make Franco the future leader of Spain. Not only him, but most of the prominent generals and lower ranking officers that would fight on the rebel side and then also on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War served either in the Legion or the Regulares directly under Franco's command. Franco is de facto in command of the Spanish Foreign Legion for most of the Rif War. Even though Milan Estrella was technically the leader of it, he was out of action for most of the war due to wounds. It seemed like he would get wounded and then come back and then get wounded immediately again, leaving Franco in charge. So he rose very rapidly in rank during this war. I think he rose from major to brigadier general in the course of a couple years and became the youngest general in Spain. He also sort of cultivated a cult of personality in this war, where he knew how to kind of project a public image, and he knew what the Spanish soldier understood and respected. Just personal bravery and physical courage and a sort of sense of humor about the danger that he was in. Franco just knew how to do this perfectly. All the pictures you see of him, he's smiling, he looks like he's having a good time. His men just looked up to him very, very much, and he was very well. I wouldn't really exactly say that he was loved, but he was very admired and respected, and he was sort of the natural choice for most people as a leader as a result of this. He became a public hero. He became sort of the face of the good part of the Spanish military experience, I guess you might say. And also, most of the brutality of the Legion was his work, was his doing. Because despite the fact that he was generally a pretty smiling and inoffensive looking person and didn't really seem to cause much friction with people, he was extraordinarily brutal and ordered massacres, and brutal practices without much conscience at all. And as you said, he then went on to be one of the principal leaders of the Spanish military academy after that, and impressed his ideas on the whole army as a whole. This would also lead him to be in a prominent position for, in 1934, a couple years before the war starts, There was a revolt in the Asturias region. It's a region in northern Spain, mining region, where anarchists and anarcho-communist militias took control in an attempted general strike and revolution, which didn't really materialize elsewhere in the country, but did in Asturias and led to like a 6-week campaign where these Asturian anarchist and communist militias fought against the Spanish Foreign Legion and elements of the Regulares. And at this time, the Spanish Foreign Legion was composed mainly of Moroccan soldiers who would have been, again, on the other side in the Rif War. So the fusion of these two people then went to suppress this revolt in Spain and did it with like just horrifying brutality. This also then made this into an issue in Spanish politics where the conservative side of Spanish politics had to endorse this brutality, because they were in favor of the suppression of the leftist revolt. So this made Spanish conservatism into a proto-fascist movement that like glorified violence against its citizens, as though the citizen was an internal enemy.
Yeah. It's a bad situation all around.
This really wasn't something that had happened in Spain before, although there had been plenty of civil wars and civil conflict. It didn't really have this nature. It wasn't really, although they would be brutal in the wars in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that type of brutal. Like it wasn't intentionally brutal. It wasn't people walking around with arms on their bayonets and parading them down the streets of Madrid. That's something new that comes out of this Rif War.
Yeah, I think there's a very strong case to be made that if it wasn't for the war in Morocco and what it did to the Spanish army, things would have gone differently in the 1930s.
I believe exactly. Like, I think you can see that between the difference between the coalition that does take place in the Spanish Civil War and then the Primo de Rivera dictatorship. Because I kind of see Primo de Rivera as being the last of the pronunciamientos that happened in the 19th century, and these didn't really have the same character as Franco's regime at all. Like there, it was kind of seemed like it was like a patriotic thing where a general steps in, gets rid of a corrupt government, institutes some kind of reform, and then steps away, to let the new government function. And that was completely different than what Franco had in mind. Franco had in mind that he would be the state, and that shows the difference in outlook between the 19th century Spanish militarist and the new 20th century Spanish militarist. And I think that this became totalitarian through the brutal experience of this Rif War.
I think that's an excellent point, and one that hasn't really occurred to me before, that the comparison between Franco and Primo, who really are only 10 years apart in terms of the times they started ruling Spain, at least, and yet the difference in their character and the nature of their regimes is absolutely stark.
That's true.
So I think the experience of Morocco must have had a large part to do with that. I mean, Franco once said, I can't understand my life without Morocco, as in his experience there. And I think the brutality of what happened in Morocco is directly transposed onto Spain and the Franco regime that was to come.
I think you're right about that. I think that the men who were the Africanista faction who fought in this war, it did really set them apart from the rest of Spain. Like, they were kind of aliens among the Spanish citizens. Like, their nation, to a certain extent, was the army rather than Spain. And it was very easy for these people to formulate an ideology and a system of thought that saw the army and the society as opposed. And I think this is what happened in the Spanish Civil War, which is basically the Spanish army and the Spanish colony of Morocco attacked the country of Spain, and like, I think that the fusion of these two warrior ethos between like the Legion and the Regulares, and then the regular Moroccan tradition of warrior virtue, just was different than contemporary Spanish society, and made it very easy for the army to see themselves as the enemy of the people.
Well, on that grim note, I think it's time to end a really fascinating discussion there about the war in Spanish Morocco and its consequences. We would highly recommend that you check out Mark's podcast, Record of Arms. He covers a variety of conflicts and kind of aspects of conflicts, as well as, I believe, like different military equipment and aircraft and things like that from the 20th century. In particular, if you've enjoyed this, he's got a very in-depth series about the Moroccan War. And he's also got feature series on German intervention in the Spanish Civil War, the naval combat in the Spanish Civil War, armored conflict in the Spanish Civil War, amongst lots of other things to do with 20th century conflict as well. So very much, if you enjoyed this, you can find much more of Mark talking about Morocco, talking about Spain, talking about other conflicts over at Record of Arms podcast.
A big thank you to Mark for coming on the show. There will be a link to his podcast down in the description. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So from us here at History's Most, I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex, and thanks for listening.
Well, there's another exciting episode of History's Most done. Just to remind everyone, we are now on Patreon, and we also have a Facebook group. The link to those both will be down in the description.
That's right. Come join us for historical debate and discussion, and give your own opinion about what was history's worst colonial war, and, of course, all our other topics. And if you are feeling generous and want to support the show and keep it going in the future, the History's Most Patreon, $1 a month, 50 cents a show, we would be so grateful. And remember, if you sign up to the Patreon this month, you will be entered into a prize draw to win a copy of a biography of history's most complicated man, Oliver Cromwell.
Again, thank you from us here at History's Most.